It's October 1688, and a ship carrying 200 French Protestant families approaches the rocky shores of the Cape of Good Hope. These weren't ordinary immigrants seeking better economic opportunities. These were religious refugees, men, women, and children who had lost everything in their homeland, fleeing with nothing but the clothes on their backs, and an unshakable faith that had already cost them dearly. Among them was a winemaker named Jacques de Savoy, who clutched a small leather pouch containing grape seeds from the vineyards of Languedoc. A silk weaver named Pierre Joubert carried the patterns and techniques passed down through generations of his family. And there was Marie Dutoit, a widow with 3 children who possessed knowledge of traditional French cooking that would soon transform Cape cuisine forever. What these exhausted refugees couldn't possibly have known, as they stepped onto African soil, was that their arrival would unleash a chain of events that would fundamentally reshape the Cape Colony. Their influence would spread far beyond what their small numbers should have allowed, creating ripples that would be felt for centuries to come. But here's the most remarkable part. Despite being just a tiny fraction of the Cape's population, these French Huguenots would leave behind 7 distinct and lasting impacts that continue to shape South Africa today. And when I say lasting, I mean some of these impacts are literally written into the DNA of modern South African society. Hello, I'm Dr. Adam Cameron, and this is Missing History Records. Who were these extraordinary people? How did religious persecution in France lead to one of the most successful immigrant integrations in colonial history? And why do their contributions still matter over 335 years later? The answers to these questions reveal a story of resilience, innovation, and cultural fusion that goes far beyond simple immigration. This is the story of how a small group of French religious refugees became the architects of traditions that millions of South Africans still practice today, often without even knowing their French origins. From the wine in your glass, to the surnames on street signs, from architectural styles to culinary traditions, the Huguenot legacy is woven so deeply into South African culture that it's become virtually invisible, hiding in plain sight. By the end of this documentary, you'll discover 7 specific ways the Huguenot migration of 1688 changed the Cape Colony forever. Some of these impacts are economic, others cultural, and a few are so profound they literally shape the genetic makeup of entire communities. But all of them demonstrate how a small group of determined refugees can transform an entire society. To understand the magnitude of what happened in 1688, we need to travel back to France, in the 1680s, where King Louis XIV was orchestrating one of history's most systematic campaigns of religious persecution. The French Huguenots were Protestant Christians who had practiced their faith openly for over a century, protected by the Edict of Nantes, issued in 1598. This royal decree had granted them religious freedom, the right to hold public office, and even the privilege of maintaining their own fortified towns. For nearly 90 years, France had been a model of religious tolerance in a Europe torn apart by sectarian conflicts. But Louis XIV, the Sun King, had different plans. Obsessed with creating a unified Catholic France, he began systematically dismantling Huguenot rights throughout the 1680s. Protestant temples were demolished. Children were forcibly removed from their families to be raised as Catholics. Huguenot businesses were boycotted and destroyed. The final blow came in October 1685 when Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes entirely. Overnight, being Protestant in France became not just illegal, but dangerous. Huguenots faced imprisonment, torture, or death if they refused to convert to Catholicism. Their pastors were exiled, their Bibles burned, their community structures obliterated. The result? One of the largest refugee crises in European history. Between 1685 and 1700, approximately 200,000 Huguenots fled France, scattering across Protestant Europe and beyond. They went to England, to Holland, to Germany, and even to the distant shores of America and the Cape of Good Hope. But here's what made the Huguenots different from typical refugees. They weren't just fleeing poverty or war. They were some of France's most skilled artisans, educated professionals, and successful merchants. France had essentially expelled its own middle class, and other nations were about to benefit enormously from Louis XIV's religious fanaticism. The Dutch East India Company, which controlled the Cape Colony, recognized this opportunity immediately. The Cape desperately needed skilled settlers, people who could develop agriculture, establish industries, and create a self-sustaining economy. The company had been struggling to attract quality immigrants to this remote outpost, and suddenly, they had access to highly skilled French refugees who had nowhere else to go. The timing was perfect. The Cape Colony, established in 1652, was still a struggling settlement of barely 2,000 Dutch colonists. The indigenous Khoikhoi people had been largely displaced or absorbed into the colonial economy, and the small Dutch population was insufficient to develop the region's agricultural potential. So when the Dutch East India Company offered free passage and land grants to French Huguenot families, the response was immediate and enthusiastic. These weren't desperate masses seeking any escape. These were carefully selected families with specific skills the Cape Colony needed: viticulture, agriculture, crafts, and trade. The first ship carrying 164 Huguenot refugees arrived at the Cape on the 31st of December, 1687. A second ship brought another 100 in 1688. By 1689, approximately 270 French Huguenots had settled in the Cape Colony, representing about 12% of the total European population. That might seem like a small number, but it was precisely this manageable size that allowed for successful integration. Unlike massive waves of immigration that can overwhelm existing communities, the Huguenot migration was large enough to maintain its cultural identity while small enough to integrate successfully with the existing Dutch population. The Dutch East India Company had learned from previous failed colonization attempts. They didn't just dump refugees at the Cape and hope for the best. Instead, they provided land grants in carefully selected areas, offered initial supplies and tools, and most importantly, encouraged intermarriage between French and Dutch settlers. The stage was set for something unprecedented, a planned integration of two Protestant communities that would create a new, hybrid culture, uniquely suited to the challenges of colonial South Africa. The Huguenots brought skills, knowledge, and determination. The Dutch provided established infrastructure, local knowledge, and administrative support. And what happened next would exceed everyone's expectations, creating impacts that would echo through South African history for centuries to come. Impact 1. The wine industry revolution. The most visible and economically significant impact of Huguenot migration was the transformation of Cape wine production from a struggling experiment into a world-class industry. When the Huguenots arrived, the Dutch had already been attempting to produce wine for over 30 years, but with limited success. Their wines were barely drinkable, suitable only for local consumption by settlers who had few alternatives. The Huguenots changed everything. Families like the Joubert, de Villiers, and Dutoit brought with them centuries of winemaking knowledge gleaned from France's premier wine regions. They understood soil composition, grape varieties, fermentation techniques, and aging processes that the Dutch had never mastered. Jacques de Savoy, originally from Languedoc, established the first truly successful vineyard in what is now Stellenbosch. He introduced French grape varieties and implemented traditional winemaking methods adapted to Cape conditions. Within a decade, Cape wines were not only satisfying local demand, they were beginning to compete with imported European wines. The transformation was so dramatic that by 1700, wine had become one of the Cape Colony's most valuable exports. The Dutch East India Company, which had been importing wine at considerable expense, suddenly found itself with a surplus. A surplus it could sell to passing ships and export to other Dutch colonies. But the Huguenot contribution went beyond technical knowledge. They established the cultural foundation of South African wine, the tradition of wine estates as family businesses, the integration of winemaking with hospitality, and the celebration of harvest seasons, all trace back to French Huguenot customs. Today, many of South Africa's most prestigious wineries still bear Huguenot names: Bachendal, La Motte, Rickety Bridge. And the wine routes that now attract millions of tourists follow paths first laid out by French refugees more than 300 years ago. Impact 2. Agricultural innovation and diversification. Beyond wine, the Huguenots transformed Cape agriculture in ways that would feed a colony and eventually a nation. Where the Dutch had focused almost entirely on grain and livestock, the French refugees introduced a much broader agricultural vision, one rooted in diversity, experimentation, and long-term sustainability. Pierre Joubert, one of the early settlers, brought with him the delicate knowledge of silk production. He planted the Cape's first mulberry trees and raised the first silkworms ever seen on South African soil. Now silk never became a major industry, but the attempt? It revealed something crucial: the Huguenots' willingness to innovate, to adapt their European knowledge to unfamiliar African conditions. But that was just the beginning. Huguenot farmers introduced advanced irrigation techniques, crop rotation methods, and soil management practices that pushed Cape agriculture forward by decades. They planted the colony's first market gardens, growing vegetables and fruits that not only improved daily diets, but also supplied fresh produce to the ships that anchored in Table Bay. Even more significantly, the Huguenots laid the groundwork for what would become South Africa's world-renowned deciduous fruit industry: apples, pears, peaches, plums. They cultivated orchards that still bear fruit centuries later. Why did it work? Because French farming techniques were perfectly suited to the Cape's Mediterranean climate. They understood how to manage limited rainfall, how to shield crops from harsh winds, and how to maximize output from relatively small plots of land. In a colony where every acre of fertile ground was precious, these skills were nothing short of revolutionary. Impact 3. Architectural and cultural landscape. The Huguenots fundamentally changed the physical appearance of the Cape Colony through their distinctive architectural style. These French refugees brought building techniques that combined European sophistication with practical adaptations to local African conditions. The most recognizable feature of Huguenot architecture, it became known as the Cape Dutch style, a striking fusion of French elegance and Dutch simplicity. French settlers introduced curved gables, symmetrical facades, and ornate decorative elements that turned the Cape's stark utilitarian buildings into something far more refined. Their homes were built to last. They featured thick walls for insulation, large windows for natural light, and covered verandas to protect from both sun and rain. They also pioneered the use of local materials, yellowwood, stinkwood, and native stone, creating buildings that were not only beautiful, but perfectly suited to the climate of the Cape. But the Huguenots' architectural influence didn't stop at the front door. In towns like Franschhoek, they designed entire communities with central squares, tree-lined streets, and carefully planned public spaces. This sense of urban planning helped shape the layout of Cape towns for generations, creating the template for what we now think of as the South African village aesthetic. Even their churches left a lasting legacy. Built in the style of French Protestant design, these simple yet elegant sanctuaries became models for ecclesiastical architecture across the region. Today, Cape Dutch architecture is more than a style, it's a cultural treasure. Preserved, restored, and celebrated, these buildings remain a uniquely South African contribution to world architecture, all born from the vision of refugees who turned survival into beauty. Impact 4. Language and cultural integration. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Huguenot settlement was how quickly and completely they integrated, linguistically, with the Dutch population. Within just 2 generations, most Huguenot families had adopted Dutch as their primary language, yet they left behind something far more permanent than speech. They infused it with French soul. This integration was not only rapid, it was profound. The Dutch East India Company actively encouraged intermarriage between French and Dutch settlers. And by the early 1700s, most Huguenot families had at least one Dutch spouse. Their children grew up bilingual. But as Dutch became the language of commerce, schooling, and governance, French quietly faded from everyday life. Yet, not entirely. The French language didn't vanish. It transformed. It slipped into the Cape's dialect, embedding itself into what would later become known as Afrikaans. Hundreds of French words entered everyday vocabulary, especially in the world of wine, food, and farming. Words like confit, from the French confit, butter from beurre, and even pied-sang from pisang, passed through French colonial channels into the Cape tongue. But the Huguenots' impact on culture went beyond language. They also helped shape a uniquely South African Protestant identity. Their French Reformed church traditions blended with Dutch Reformed customs, resulting in religious practices that were adapted to the realities of colonial life. And just as they brought knowledge to the vineyard, they also brought it to the classroom. French refugees established some of the first schools in Cape districts, introducing educational methods that combined practical skills with academic study. This emphasis on learning helped build something extraordinary, one of the highest literacy rates of any colonial society in the world at that time. A language faded, a culture integrated. But through words, worship, and education, the French Huguenots helped write the early chapters of South African identity. Impact 5. Economic development and trade networks. The Huguenots' economic impact went far beyond the vineyards and orchards. They brought with them sophisticated commercial knowledge, international trading connections, and the kind of entrepreneurial energy that would transform the economy of the Cape Colony from the ground up. Many of these refugees had been merchants and traders back in France, well-connected individuals with ties that stretched across Protestant Europe. And even in exile, they held on to those networks, maintaining relationships with communities in Holland, England, and Germany. These connections quickly became essential to Cape trade, offering markets for local products and steady access to imported goods the colony could never produce on its own. But trade wasn't their only contribution. French refugees opened some of the Cape's first proper retail businesses. Not just basic supply posts, but shops, workshops, and service enterprises that laid the foundation for a cash economy in what had been a barter-based frontier. And they didn't stop there. The Huguenots launched entirely new industries in the colony. They built the first successful tanneries, producing high-quality leather goods that quickly spread across the region. They introduced knowledge of textiles, weaving, metalwork, craft traditions that diversified the Cape's economy and reduced dependency on European imports. But perhaps most importantly, the Huguenots understood the power of reputation. They were among the first in the Cape to create products associated with consistent quality goods that could command premium prices in both local and foreign markets. They didn't just produce more, they produced better. And in doing so, they redefined what Cape commerce could be. Impact 6. Social structure and community development. The arrival of the Huguenots didn't just boost the economy or transform agriculture. It reshaped the very structure of Cape society. Unlike the Dutch, many of whom came as company employees or individual adventurers, the French refugees arrived in complete family units. They brought with them well-defined social hierarchies and strong community structures built on centuries of shared faith and resilience. They didn't just settle, they organized. Mutual aid societies were quickly established, communal work projects launched, and social institutions built to support one another while preserving their cultural identity. But the Huguenots also brought a different mindset, especially when it came to education and social mobility. Back in France, many had been artisans, craftsmen, and small merchants who believed that hard work and learning could elevate one's station in life. This merit-based perspective stood in contrast to the more rigid, hierarchy-bound mindset of the Dutch company system, and it began to influence how success was measured in the colony. They didn't just value education, they invested in it. Huguenot families established the first private schools in many Cape districts, introducing teaching methods that emphasized practical skills alongside the usual academic subjects. Over time, these schools helped make the Cape one of the most literate colonial settlements anywhere in the world. They also brought a different kind of family structure. French households were typically more nuclear, less dependent on extended family networks, and more inclined toward independent living. This shift played a subtle but important role in fostering a more individualistic colonial society, one where innovation and self-reliance became cultural norm. Impact 7. Genetic and demographic legacy. The final and perhaps most profound legacy of the Huguenot migration was not something you could see in architecture or taste in wine, but something carried quietly, invisibly in bloodlines. Despite making up just a small percentage of the Cape's early population, the Huguenots left an extraordinary genetic imprint on South African society. Intermarriage between French and Dutch settlers happened rapidly, so rapidly in fact, that by 1750, nearly every Dutch family at the Cape could trace at least some ancestry back to France. In many cases, French surnames had blended so completely into colonial society that few even remembered where they came from. Modern genetic studies have confirmed what the records only hinted at. Today, about 35% of Afrikaner genetic heritage can be traced directly to Huguenot ancestry, even though the French settlers never made up more than 15% of the population. So how did this happen? It wasn't just about intermarriage. It was also about family structure and the conditions that supported growth. Huguenot families tended to be larger, and their children had higher survival rates thanks to better nutrition, better hygiene, and healthcare knowledge brought from Europe and adapted to African conditions. Each generation amplified the demographic imprint, and by the 19th century, French heritage was not a background detail, it was a foundational strand in the DNA of South African society. Today, millions of South Africans carry Huguenot surnames. Names like de Troyes, Joubert, de Villiers, Marais, and Malan, names that trace their roots back to just a few hundred refugees who stepped ashore in 1688. The 7 impacts of Huguenot migration created a cascade of consequences that extended far beyond the original refugee settlement. By 1720, just 30 years after their arrival, the French Huguenots had fundamentally transformed the Cape Colony from a struggling Dutch outpost into a thriving, diverse, and economically viable settlement. The economic consequences were immediate and profound. Wine production became one of the Cape's most valuable industries, generating revenue that funded further colonial expansion and development. Agricultural diversification reduced the colony's dependence on imported food, making it more self-sufficient and economically stable. The success of Huguenot integration became a model for future immigration to the Cape. The Dutch East India Company learned that skilled immigrants with compatible cultural backgrounds could be successfully integrated through careful planning land grants and the encouragement of intermarriage. This model would go on to influence later German and British immigration policies. Culturally, the Huguenot legacy created a unique Cape identity, one that was neither purely Dutch nor French, but something entirely new. This hybrid culture proved remarkably resilient and adaptable, and it laid the foundation for the development of a distinctly South African identity. The architectural influence of the Huguenots shaped a built environment that defined the Cape's character for centuries. Cape Dutch architecture became a symbol of South African heritage, preserved and celebrated as a unique contribution to world architecture. But perhaps most significantly, the Huguenot migration demonstrated that successful cultural integration was possible without requiring complete assimilation. The French refugees maintained aspects of their cultural identity while fully participating in colonial society. This model of integration would later shape South African attitudes toward immigration and cultural diversity. The long-term consequences extended into the modern era. The wine industry they established became one of South Africa's most successful international exports. The agricultural techniques they introduced laid the foundation for South Africa's rise as a major food exporter. Their genetic and demographic legacy became part of the complex ethnic mixture that defines modern South Africa. The successful merging of French and Dutch settlers set a precedent, a proof that diverse European groups could integrate, setting the tone for later, more ambitious and sometimes contentious attempts at cultural blending. Yet, the Huguenot legacy was not without complications. Their successful integration also contributed to the development of a unified white colonial identity, one that would later be folded into the rise of Afrikaner nationalism and eventually apartheid. Still, the educational and cultural institutions established by Huguenot communities became models for development across southern Africa. Their emphasis on practical education, community organization, and economic independence influenced settlements far beyond the Cape. Today, the Huguenot legacy lives on in vineyards that employ hundreds of thousands, in export revenues worth billions, in the architecture of the Western Cape, and in the surnames carried by millions of South Africans. The story of the Huguenots is a story of how a small group of skilled, determined refugees transformed an entire society. Their success was no accident. It was the product of their resilience, the openness of the Dutch community, the policies of the Dutch East India Company, and the historic moment into which they arrived. The Huguenot migration of 1688 remains one of history's most successful examples of refugee integration, a quiet revolution whose echoes still shape South African society over 3 centuries later. The story of the French Huguenots who arrived at the Cape in 1688 is ultimately a story about the power of human resilience and the unexpected ways that crisis can create opportunity. What began as a desperate flight from religious persecution became one of the most successful immigrant integrations in colonial history. The 7 lasting impacts we've explored, from wine production to genetic heritage, demonstrate how a small group of skilled refugees could transform an entire society. The Huguenots succeeded because they brought valuable skills, integrated willingly with existing populations, and adapted their European knowledge to African conditions. Their legacy reminds us that immigration, when properly managed and supported, can benefit both the newcomers and the societies that receive them. The Huguenots didn't just survive at the Cape, they thrived. They created wealth, culture, and traditions that continue to enrich South African society today. Perhaps most remarkably, the Huguenot story shows how quickly and how completely cultural integration can occur when there is mutual respect and shared values. Within 2 generations, French refugees had become Cape settlers, contributing to a new hybrid culture that was uniquely South African. The next time you taste South African wine, admire Cape Dutch architecture, or hear Afrikaans spoken, remember the French refugees who arrived in 1688 with nothing but their faith and determination. Their story proves that sometimes the most profound changes in history don't come from great armies or powerful kings, but from ordinary people responding to extraordinary circumstances with courage, skill, and hope. The Huguenots' legacy lives on, woven into the very fabric of South African society, a testament to the enduring power of human adaptation and the unexpected gifts that refugees can bring to their new homes.